So I'm very, in the long run, very supportive of AI. We got lots of issues we got to work for. There are teeth and claws out there we know nothing about that we're going to discover. We had that with the internet. We had that with boiler pressure. We've had it with pretty much any disruptive technology. We are forced to take the good with the bad.
Welcome, everyone, to the AI Governance Podcast, where we discuss practical approaches for responsible AI practitioners. My name is Shankar, and today we're excited to have with us Scott Cooper. Scott's career has been focused on global governance issues, including as VP for Policy at the American National Standards Institute, also known as ANSI, and in prior roles advising the CEO of Hewlett-Packard and the U.S. House of Representatives on governance and standardization issues. So welcome, Scott, and thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So the EU AI Act is now in force, and to an extent, compliance with the Act can be shown by conforming to global standards. A group of European standardization organizations known as Sensenelec will be drafting the standards. But the purpose of our conversation today is really to zoom out and to better understand how international standardization has been helpful in all kinds of fields, ranging from anti-corruption to steam engine safety, and what implications they could have for safety, education, accessibility, for law and for trade when it comes to AI as well. So looking forward to diving into these issues.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. I think these are issues that are sort of under the radar screen, and standards usually are under the radar screen. So getting these before people to think about, I think, is a very good thing.
Great. So let's start with safety. So you've spoken in the past, Scott, about how standards were developed and had a huge impact on the safety of steam engines and of coastal vessels in the early 19th century. Could you paint that picture for us a little bit?
Yeah, that was actually sort of the breakthrough for, I think, de facto solutions in a lot of cases, where before it was the nation states that, or the states in the United States, the states themselves would write rules. But what they discovered that with boilers, one, they were just so useful, either for steam engines ultimately, but in the beginning for coastal and river cruises. I mean, it just made a lot of sense, and you could take a steam engine up the Mississippi. That was something you just didn't do. You went down, but not up. Well, now you could go up as well. But what they discovered is that the technology was changing rapidly, and the rules, the de jure rules, rules in writing, were not keeping up with the problems. And this was especially true with coastal vessels and river vessels, where there was just a plethora of accidents, and they just weren't stopping. And so in the 1840s, after this had gone on for a while, the American Society for Mechanical Engineers, ASME, started. And what they did was develop and continuously developed standards for boiler pressures, for safety valves, for everything concerned with the safety and efficacy of boilers. And those standards became, in a sense, sort of the de facto standards. Everybody followed that because there was no other rules that people had any credibility in. And so that was kind of the start, and we've been building off of that ever since. Was the Mississippi steamboats, and they would explode regularly, and it was from the private sector that these solutions came. And then in the United States, especially, they would be adopted by the states and then by the federal government. There was that willingness to look to the private sector with the expertise to actually come up with solutions here. So that's how it started.
Great. And then I think, since then there's been a significant kind of expansion in standardization efforts. not just in fields related to AI safety, or sorry, to safety, but to all kinds of other
Right.
fields as well. So, one of those areas is education, uh, which is seen as a major challenge in the AI space. A lot of people need to learn a lot of different skills quickly. One of the first provisions of the AI Act to come into force is uh, Article 4, which requires an AI literacy program to be in place by February 2025. And so, this is also an area that you've spoken about with regard to how engineering education benefited from standardization again in the 19th century.
Yeah, it was really what was the Moral Act in the United States, which it came about in the Civil War of all times. But Lincoln and Congress wanted to make sure that as we expanded west, that was infrastructure, including high schools and colleges that were ready for students, coming out. And the land grant colleges that developed from the Moral Act were certainly known for their agricultural services. That was probably that they were most famous for. But they also did engineering, and that was really the start of engineering in this country, of more than just apprentices, where there was actually programs, formal programs for learning the skill sets you needed to be an engineer, chemical engineer, mechanical engineer, whatever it was. And so these schools really took the lead on that. The land grant colleges decided that these were the skills that their people needed most, certainly in the agricultural side, but also on the engineering side, because no one was coming from the East. They need to homegrown their skill sets here, and that's what happened. And I'm the graduate of a land grant. My wife is, our daughter is. These are important pieces to our national infrastructure, and we need to use these, I think, for AI, in the sense that up until now, we learn computerese. You have to learn, you start off with DOS or whatever, and you just laboriously work your way up. And we're still doing that, here 30 years later, and we never know until we meet like today, whether it's really going to work or not. Well, the nice thing about AI is that it speaks English, it speaks Finnish, it speaks Serbo-Croatian, whatever, in an idiomatic way. You can ask a question in your own words, and get an answer that is credible, or at least is one that you can sense the logic behind it. Now, if it's a hallucination, well, those are issues we need to work on. But the answers are ones that fit within a pattern we feel comfortable with. And so I think that once we see AI taking off, I know that English teachers blanch about the idea of AI, for in the English classroom. But if you create, a partnership with an AI program and come up with something that is creative and new and yours, isn't that something that has value to it, or should have value to it? And I think that there are a lot of fields, philosophy, sociology, that could really use those kinds of questions, those kinds of dialogues, with a very smart machine. And it's not that there's a hierarchy here or anything like that, but it's a partnership and a stewardship obligation, I think, of the machine to helping people out. So I'm very, in the long run, very supportive of AI. We got lots of issues we got to work for. There are teeth and claws out there we know nothing about, that we're going to discover. We had that with the internet. We had that with boiler pressure. We've had it with pretty much any disruptive technology. We are forced to take the good with the bad. So, but the good is usually much better, and it gets us further along that road toward progress.
Yeah. So you've kind of talked about the continuity here, about how innovation in these fields is not new. People learning how to work collaboratively with these new technologies is not
Right.
new. And even AI research is not a new field.
No, it's been around since the 60s.
Yeah. So this is what seems different here is the accessibility. People from any background can kind of talk to commercially available large language models in English or in their own language many times. So it kind of gives a user interface to everyone.
Right.
You mentioned a couple of those implications in it, hallucinations, potential privacy breaches, and things like that. What do you feel are the broader implications of this accessibility for how people work collaboratively with technology?
I think what we're going to have to do is, again, I think standards are a place that is at the beginning of that process. But I think we're going to have a very collaborative, consensual process that brings everybody who needs to be at the table. Civil society for sure. Academics. Unions, whatever, whomever. And with AI, it is pretty much everybody. But so I think it has to be a much broader discussion than we're having right now. I mean, you were talking about the EU and what's Brussels been doing, and they've had a hard time getting traction on this. And I know that they want to be, at the front of the line. Now, this is kind of important for them to do so. But just this last go around, this last week or so, a lot of large companies in Europe have not signed on to agreeing to this, including Mistral, which is, the AI, the biggest company. And they have not signed on to this at this point because they don't know how it's all going to play out. And it is very early to be setting rules, setting guidelines. Well, set guidelines, and the guardrails and all that. We need those. But strict rules, prescriptive rules, we're very early for trying to do that.
And that's so, given the kind of different kinds of AI governance instruments that we have, industry best practices are kind of the fastest and most responsive. And then at the other end, people usually talk about laws that are,
Right.
kind of rigid. They're subject to the democratic process, so they have the most legitimacy,
Right.
but they're also kind of difficult to change. So one thing you've talked about is how standards can kind of help with can become incorporated into law and then give laws a bit of a dynamic element, where kind of technocratic groups are evolving the standard that's already incorporated into law. Have you seen this work particularly well in any other fields?
Well, I can the example I like a lot is, remember about 15 years ago there was a problem with lead in toys. Thomas the Tank Engine would come to the state and be put in the mouth of a 2-year-old, and you're discovering toxic levels of lead paint, in those toys that were coming in. And our lead agency, CPSC, was signing all kinds of memorandum of understanding with Chinese manufacturers and the Chinese government about trying to stop this, but it just wasn't working. That there was not that sense of concern on the Chinese side, because they were selling a lot of products like this. And some of it was our fault because you ended up with large corporations or retailers constantly cutting the costs that they had to pay for products. And sooner or later, you'd run into problems. Well, we can do this, but lead paint, it dries faster. It has a nice glow to it, and it's cheaper, but it's toxic. But you would end up with these decisions, being discussed, or at least in people's mind. And so, lead paint did creep into the supply chains. And so what we did was we worked, ANSI at the time, worked with the National Toy Association and retailers like Walmart and the consumer groups, and came up with a solution that had testing, inspection, and auditing, not by our government inspectors, but by ISO accredited and inspected inspectors to do testing, inspection, and auditing for these programs. And the Chinese were willing to accept that. They would not allow U.S. inspectors into their factories, but they would allow ISO because they use ISO a lot. And so that was the solution. So it was space saving for the Chinese. If they were going to sell into global marketplaces, they had to get rid of that lead. So this allowed them a path to be able to do that, where they still stayed in control of their country's products. So that and it worked. And the follow through was that solution was added to the Toy Safety Act of 2 years later, CPSA of 2012, I think. And so that became law. Those rules and regs that were developed as a consensus process with the retailers and with the manufacturers, and ANSI became part of the public law, and everybody accepted it at that point because it was the solution that worked best. So that's my best my best
Yeah.
case that I can come up with right now.
Yeah. So that's a fascinating example because you have both kind of uh, companies, countries, and others, of varying sizes, all kind of coming together and solving this problem together.
Yeah,
So, even in the case of AI standards today, or kind of AI governance more broadly today, you see kind of these uh, middle to emerging to smaller players globally, that smaller countries that are just looking at what the global norm is going to be so that they can continue to kind of sell into global markets.
right.
So countries like Singapore, for example,
Yes,
that are advocates for global standardization because of its facilitating role in trade. And for smaller or like for companies of all sizes, really, it's also important to have good rules of the road. So do you kind of see this dynamic playing out any differently now that, for example, the Chinese economy is much bigger, the EU has kind of taken a really strong uh, like horizontal approach to regulating AI. How do you see the role that standards are going to be playing in facilitating international trade for AI?
well, I hope they play a large role, but I think in the short run and maybe even in the middle term, it's going to be very messy because I think that people are going off on their own tangents, and especially nation states. Who's going to tell them otherwise? I mean, your laws are good until you come to your border, and then 10 feet over, somebody else's laws start up, and they may be very different than yours. And so, in the global marketplace, it is de facto standards that mostly run the global marketplace. And it's because, one, you get consensus, everybody participates or should, and that's an issue that we have with standards, is making sure that all who need to participate feel that need and are participating. And I'm hoping that things like your blog are going to help get that message out, that we need to have standards uh, more credible in problem solving than they have been today.
Great. You mentioned kind of the fragmented approaches that everybody's kind of still figuring this out, and different jurisdictions have taken different approaches to AI. And this is at the same time that AI continues to impress us with every new model kind of has new capabilities that are impressive and that can be incorporated into different workflows in different ways. Um, I guess another approach is there's a whole school of thought now that argues that AI risks should really be thought of as like an extension or a delta to an existing risk, because you have something like human resources and recruiting, which is very different from something like autonomous vehicles. And so putting it all under the blanket of AI, kind of a better approach might be to think about what is the delta from AI, and then you already have well-developed standards in each of these fields that AI can kind of be worked into. Do you have any thoughts on the kind of merits of that approach?
Yeah, and it is more than standards. I mean, you've got, certainly in the Western world, and most of Asia as well. You've got a body of consumer law. Now, sometimes it's sort of recognized in passing, but other times in the United States and most of Europe, it is the body of norms that we live by. And so there's a lot of issues, fraud, patterns of abuse, a lot of basic, issues on felonies and misdemeanors that we can already cover, even if they are, the vehicle being used is AI. We saw that with the internet. There's regulation of the internet, and it's a work in progress too. But a lot of it just falls into basic common law. And so I think that that's very important. And again, with incorporation, you can start off with a standard, and you can ultimately end up with that standard being accepted, in a nation, or in a region, or worldwide.
Great. So I really liked this kind of this statistic that you'd shared, which is in 1866 there were only 300 graduates in engineering. By 1911, the U.S. had over 38,000 certified engineers, the most in the world, and standards were their textbooks.
Huh.
So
I'm glad you like that. I'm glad you like that.
so that's the kind of scalability that we need today in terms of AI training and in terms of people being participating in and learning from standards. So how can we make standards more accessible to people who are interested?
Well, I think AI is going to help drive that. I think that it is just a perfect forcing mechanism for getting standards, because how else are we going to play this out? And there's lots of cacophony out there. There's lots of different ideas, but there's no obvious path forward, except I think again, de facto, for a global marketplace. We've got to fill in the pieces in a consensus process, and that means more and more people have got to become involved. And I think that you're seeing a lot in the UK and in a lot in the Department of Commerce in the United States, where that I think is an accepted position. And I think it's also, again, sort of okay in Brussels as well, as we saw that with the real bifurcation about how European companies are taking the EU AI rules at this point. There's no consensus, and who knows what China's going to do, but they do need to help their those who are involved in global supply chains are core to what they do. So I think there's a lot of issues here that are sort of, again, forcing mechanisms for having these conversations, and they may be in diverse place. And one of the things that I think we're going to see is not only is this going to scale, but I think it's going to diversify. We need to get the English professors somehow on board. Not easily, but they need to be on board as well. But certainly philosophy, sociology, there's a lot of issues where we don't know what we don't know. And we saw that with the telescope, where Webb and Hubble are still just surprising us on almost a daily basis, with things that they're learning about how the universe works that was entirely different from how we expected it to work. So these are issues that I think AI can be very helpful. And again, it's fits and starts, and there's going to be lots of issues that we're going to have to deal with. But I think that it's within the construct of a new technology that can be very, very helpful to the world people.
Great. So I think we're going to have to leave it there today. I wanted to ask Scott, where should listeners go to learn more about your work and about standards and kind of emerging modes of governance more generally?
Well, I can give them my my email address. I'm willing to do that. It's spcooper14@gmail.com. spcooper14@gmail.com. And I'm happy to get responses on that. A lot of it at this point is just talking to people, because there's no sense of, I guess, an imperative that we need to immediately, hold the plenary meeting, or the meeting of the great and the good, or whatever it may be, to resolve these things. You have all kinds of meetings going on, and people throwing their hands up and clucking like chickens or whatever. But there's no sense that we know the path that we need to go down, and that's the process that hopefully this podcast and others, and people just talking to each other can help to support. But there are a lot of people who are aware of these issues, usually as a one-off that they worked to themselves. Whether it's the toy industry, or whoever it may be, which then became actually the food industry, because they took the same path as well. So there's people out there, but they only know standards as their issue. And the nice thing about standards these days is it is all inclusive. And the more we get into these, I won't say ephemeral, but these issues that are very fuzzy around the edges, standards look better than prescriptive, bright line solutions by the nation states.
Yeah, so I'm kind of optimistic about the sorts of conversations people have been having about AI governance. I think I've noticed two differences in the past few months. One is that people tend to be more informed, which I guess happens with time.
Forcing mechanism.
You're right. And the other is that they're more focused on particular contexts and use cases, which is, as you're saying, that's kind of a natural place to start because the communities already exist, the kind of
Yeah.
history and backgrounds already exist. So really appreciate all that insight. Thanks so much for joining us for this conversation and sharing your understanding of standards and their role in governance. Thank you everybody for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Far.